to be understood as a commitment and responsibility and just not a way of just managing economics. And also the idea that we're training human capital as a job of the parents, which is fundamental. And something else last issue I'd like to say, and I'm an economist, is that we have to take into account the importance of domestic production in our financial accounts. So anyway, I'm not going to really give any sort of conclusion here because you're going to have to continue with this work. It's up to you to do so. But I'd like to say that we have to also make sure that we encourage a higher birth rate in the old continent. And this can only be done if we actually have policies that promote the family. We cannot make cradles with graves. We have to actually carry out policies that lead to actions and that actually have concrete effects. At the very end of the day as well, I think the family is an area where we see solidarity, transmission of values, but you also have to remember that at the moment what's going on is we have a very difficult situation for those who want to have children. We have to make sure that we make it easier for them. Thank you very much for your attention. I very hope that I have been able to contribute to help you all in your future actions to be able to do what you need to do. There's nothing more that I'd like to add at the moment. Thank you.
No question.
Sorry, I'm just asking how much time do we still have?
Unfortunately, we have 3 minutes, and then there's another event in this room, so
Okay, let's hope for, well, those to be very patient, and we have five minutes. Well, just 3 questions very, very quickly. Please, 1, 2, 3. I'm so sorry.
Oui, merci Romana. Merci d'avoir rappelé.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for asking the EPP to draft its paper on the family, which echoes many of your proposals. You've gone a bit quickly through the slides about family policy. It's not your fault, but I would like to know whether or not there are actual comparative studies that have been carried out about family policies implemented in the 27 member states and the effects of those policies on all those different aspects you mentioned. Have those studies been carried out? Could we get them so that we could get the inspiration from good examples in Europe?
Let's take all 3, and you will have the opportunity later.
Okay, very short. I have the impression that we cannot do anything from policy in influencing birth rate. So shouldn't we concentrate on the regions which are really affected by the transition of the demographic change? They have a decrease of people of 20–30%, looking at the infrastructure, looking at housing, looking on the innovation aspect, where are the people coming who are founding new companies in the future? So maybe we should concentrate more on this, because only in the long term we can change birth rate. And even if we can do it, we have the eco effect. There's only a small amount of people, women, who can get children now. And so because it decreased so much in the last decades.
One more.
Je voudrais vous remercier.
I'd like to first of all thank you for having quoted Michel Godet and Mr. Bouzmar, who are close friends of mine, so I'll let them know that you have spoken about the fact that they were the first people to bring up these issues. My question would be quite brief. What would, in your opinion, what would explain the fact that what's happened in Hungary, where they have invested an enormous amount, and that's had a good, and that you can see that it hasn't necessarily had the results that we'd like to have, but it's a good direction. What do you think we need to be taking into account, and where should we be moving toward? Speaker for microphone, please. I'm so sorry. My students don't know as much as you. I saw you were all paying such attention that I spent too much time speaking. I took too long. Your question is very simple. There is no family policy in Europe. There's social policy in Europe, and if it's not going well, that's because it's social and not family-based. So it's only when we implement family policies we can actually measure the positive effects, but we don't see such a policy in place right now. France itself, for example, I wouldn't say it has nothing, but it can be done a lot better. To respond to your question, I'd say that, first of all, if my information is correct, what you're suggesting, I'm not against it, but I think family policy is something that is the competence of the state and not on European level. So I don't know how we could really work on a European level to foster measures that would be effective in your level. However, I think that your question allows me to be more specific, which I perhaps was not because I didn't have enough time, which is about the fact that in surveys carried out, there are three sources that would explain the fact that couples are not having as many children as they would like to have. First of all, the cost of education, and I've spoken about that. Housing, you've spoken about that. And stability. How can you imagine that you would invest in something for 20 years if you're not even sure what the policies that are going to be implemented by the government aren't going to last that long? And let's see. Oh, I forgot. I'm sorry. Your last question. Hungary. Yes, Hungary. Yes, in the case examples I was going to tell you, I want to talk about that. But the effects are long-term effects. You can't say it's not working yet. It's a long-term thing. There is one measure in Hungary that I thought was really interesting about the notion of investment and risk-taking couples. They wait before having children, but in Hungary they put into place a measure where they give them a loan to couples without children, and to pay back that loan, they do that later on, like all loans anyone gets, you pay back later, but as more and more births happen, then the amount you need to pay back to the state is reduced. So I think that's very interesting. That shows that in that country, they've understood that it's an investment and that you have to take some risk. You have couples who want to have children but are not able to have them. You have others that that you have that situation where couples want to have children but are not able to do so. So we're going to have to see what's happening in 20 years. Let's talk about it again in 20 years.
Thank you very much for the patience. Thank you, Professor. It was very interesting. Let's go into details with your book, and I hope the presentation will be available. And thank you very much for coming here.
Thank you, Omeda.
Bon.
I think welcome, and we'll slowly kick off the meeting. Good morning to everybody, dear colleagues and guests. Welcome to today's session of the Animal Welfare Intergroup, and thank you for joining us both in person and to the people who are watching online. The focus of today's meeting is the EU-Mercosur trade agreement and its shortcomings regarding animal welfare. Despite years of negotiation and commitments to sustainability, this agreement raises some quite serious concerns about the impact on farmed animals, particularly in Brazil. The EU-Mercosur trade agreement intended to strengthen economic ties between the European Union and the Mercosur countries, which are Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. It has attracted considerable criticism from organizations across different sectors, and these groups have consistently highlighted the agreement's failure to align with EU standards on animal welfare. While the inclusion of a conditional tariff preferences for shelled eggs requiring compliance with EU equivalent animal welfare standards is welcome. It is, however, largely symbolic, since the EU barely imports shell eggs from the Mercosur countries. The majority of animal products covered by the agreement, including beef and poultry, remain eligible for preferential access without any animal welfare requirements. As the Mercosur countries often rely on intensive farming practices, the agreement risks further or contributing to fuel animal cruelty in some of these countries. By incentivizing more trade in meat derived from soy-fed animals, it also risks to further contribute to deforestation, and that's something we are very concerned with, of course. The foreign trade agreement, the Mercosur agreement, sends a counterproductive signal to European producers, jeopardizing their efforts towards transitioning to sustainable food systems. This position that I'm voicing here is reinforced by growing civil society momentum on both continents. More than 40 Brazilian NGOs, parliamentarians, and academic experts have publicly called for stronger animal welfare provisions within the trade agreement. The agreement also contradicts some of the green objectives set up by the EU in recent years, which promise to use trade policy to obtain ambitious commitments from third partners on animal welfare. So we think here in the Animal Welfare Intergroup that we of course have a priority, and we think that the EU-Mercosur agreement should have the priority of protecting animals, safeguarding public health, and advancing sustainability on both continents. And our discussion today will cover agricultural production and animal welfare realities in Brazil, the implications of this trade agreement for animals, and the economic impacts of the deal. And we have some very fine guests, speakers here today. So first we have Luciene Cavalcante, Federal Deputy, Brazilian National Congress. She made a video for us, and she'll give a short presentation. Then we have Daniel Perez Vega, who is on my left, Trade and Animal Welfare Officer at the Eurogroup for Animals. And then we have online Werner Rasa, Director of Austrian Foundation for Development Research. And they will come with their perspectives. So we will proceed shortly with the discussion. Before we kick off, I will just make this announcement that today, it's a different topic, but today we will be voting, as you know, in the plenary, and we will be voting on the legislation on the welfare and traceability of dogs and cats. And we think it's very important that there are certain amendments that we would encourage you to support. While the Agri report, it's the Agri committee that made this report, led by our Vice President Veronika Vrecianova, marks progress. We still have important gaps to be closed in this legislation. And I know that some of you are also following this legislation very closely. The Animal Welfare Intergroup urges all MEPs to support key plenary amendments to strengthen traceability, close loopholes, and close loopholes that enable illegal trade and ensure meaningful EU-level protection for companion animals. So we call for strong support for amendments tabled by the Intergroup's Companion Animal Working Group, coordinated by Petras Ostravicius, as many of you know, as well as the ENVI Committee's retabled amendments. In addition, the Intergroup urges for support for amendments to Article 26, proposed respectively by the Greens and the Left Group, calling for concrete commitments to facilitate the creation of an EU-wide positive list for pet species, a key step to better protection of animals and public health. The practical information that I used to say here, the meeting is streamed, it will be recorded, and the videos will be uploaded on the Intergroup's website. We have interpretation in English, French, German, Italian, and Polish. And a viewer link will be shared closer. You can find it online, all these recordings. Great, then we'll kick off the discussion on Mercosur, and we will start with some words on agricultural production and animal welfare in Brazil. We have Lucienne Cavalcante from the Brazilian National Congress, who will deliver a recorded message with English subtitles, providing an overview of agricultural practices in Brazil and their impact on animal welfare. So, Ms. Cavalcante will speak to us now. Oh, we need some...
Deputada federal pelo Estado de São Paulo, Partido Socialismo e Liberdade. Quero aqui fazer um apelo a todo o Parlamento Europeu com relação a esse tratado que está sendo negociado de livre comércio entre o Mercosul e o mercado europeu e toda a União Europeia. Quero aqui chamar a atenção para a questão dos direitos dos animais, da dignidade e do bem-estar animal. Quero aqui denunciar que o protocolo que já foi assinado entre o Mercosul e a União Europeia desconsidera o bem-estar animal, desconsidera a forma e a maneira indigna que os animais aqui no Brasil são criados dentro da indústria para o consumo humano, inclusive contrariando, e isso é extremamente chocante, todas as legalidades, as leis, as orientações da própria União Europeia. A gente não pode imaginar que dentro da Europa exista um tipo de legislação que proteja os direitos dos animais, que dê dignidade, que lute pelo seu bem-estar dentro da indústria agropecuária e a mesma União Europeia aceite e ache normal fazer acordos com países que vão vender esses animais que não são criados com a mesma dignidade. Nós temos uma chance histórica através desse tratado de comércio para que a gente possa elevar aqui no Brasil as leis e as formas como os animais são criados, dando dignidade, bem-estar, garantindo os seus direitos dentro da indústria agropecuária. Então, eu quero fazer esse apelo para que seja revisto esse ponto, para que o mercado europeu exija que todos os países do Mercosul tenham um plano de ação para que eles avancem na dignidade dos animais que estão sendo criados para o consumo humano. E quero ainda alertar que, além de ferir os direitos, a dignidade de todos os animais que estão sendo criados para o consumo humano, esse tratado, se continuar como está no protocolo, ele ainda vai avançar e vai deteriorar os nossos biomas, os biomas brasileiros, que já estão em processo de sofrimento. A gente vai avançar na deterioração da Amazônia, nas áreas que são protegidas, porque isso tudo vai estar aberto para a criação desses animais para o consumo humano. Então, eu quero fazer aqui um apelo ao Parlamento Europeu que reveja esse ponto. A gente está num momento muito difícil da nossa história, a nossa quadra histórica é muito desafiadora, vivemos uma emergência climática, todos nós temos corresponsabilidades e precisamos atuar de forma firme, corajosa, coerente, exigindo que as indústrias façam as adequações que são necessárias e são plausíveis. É possível a gente criar os animais de uma forma que garanta os seus direitos fundamentais, que garanta a sua integridade, que garanta o seu bem-estar. Então, faço aqui esse apelo e quero dizer que aqui no Brasil a gente segue firme lutando em defesa do bem-estar dos animais que estão na indústria agropecuária.
Okay, there were some words from the Brazilian National Congress. And before we go on to you, Daniel, I just want to say that what I pay attention to here, one of the things is that if we allow standards for animal welfare that are way lower than the standards we have in the European Union, and then we allow those products to be traded with, we might risk also doing something harmful to our farmers, as far as I can see, but maybe because they have to live up to higher standards. But maybe you can talk more about that, Daniel. So the next speaker is Daniel Perez Vega, Trade and Animal Welfare Officer at the Eurogroup for Animals. You will present some key concerns on this trade agreement and give us an overview over what is at stake for animals in this agreement. Daniel, you have 10 minutes to do just that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niels. Good morning, everybody. So, yes, I'm Daniel. I'm working for Eurogroup for Animals. I've been working here for nearly 5 years now, but also I've been in Brussels working in the EU agri-food trade policy and agri for about 10 years. For those of you who don't know Eurogroup for Animals, of course, we're the Federation of Animal Welfare Organizations, gathering a bit more than 100 members, also in South America with partners, which is very valuable when it comes to have fair-hands information and investigations. And yeah, that's me there. So I'm sure you have all heard about the EU-Mercosur deal. We've been discussing about it for 25 years now. But I've come today to explain to you why the deal, despite all the additional protocol, despite all the texts that were agreed last December, remains a bad deal for people, for animals, and for the planet. But I've also come to explain or to show perhaps a way forward, provided that some conditions are met. So allow me to start with what's at stake for animals. The deal grants significant market access to Mercosur countries, which they are already the EU's top trading partners. If we take the average trade of the 5 past years, so since the UK left the EU, and the UK is the EU's closest trading partner, you will find that Brazil is actually the top partner for chicken meat. They export on average 190,000 tons. And Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay are the top 3 partners for beef. Together, they export around 100,000 tons. And you can see from the market access that it was granted in the agreement that that corresponds more or less to the actual trade. And the European Commission, they might say that simply this agreement will shift, that Mercosur countries will just start trading the same amount under this agreement. But here is perhaps our first big disagreement, because according to all impact assessments, including those from member states and from the European Commission, trade will increase if the agreement is implemented as it stands, under any scenario, even on the conservative scenario. And we believe that trade will substantially increase, because right now, Mercosur countries, they can also export out of quotas. So they can also export and pay tariffs. And if this agreement gives them additional quotas with reduced tariffs, why wouldn't they export more? Something very interesting to have done in this agreement would have been to extend the animal welfare condition for shell eggs to all animal products. As you rightly mentioned in the introduction, this was a very innovative and a very welcome tool from the European Commission. It was the first time an animal welfare condition was in a trade agreement. And that means that shell eggs, to benefit from the agreement, must comply with the EU Lane-Side Directive. The problem here is that there is almost no trade in shell eggs. Most of the trade happens in poultry, happens in beef. So the deal will increase trade in low welfare products. It will incentivize intensive and factory farming in Mercosur countries, because those who are exporting to the EU are not small farmers. We'll look into which companies are actually exporting, and in those countries, most of the time, it's 2 or 3 big corporations. For example, GPS, I'm sure you have heard about it, is one of the big ones. Nothing wrong against big corporations, but just saying it's big companies who have these kind of systems. And this is concerning not only for the millions of animals that we will put in these systems, but also for European citizens, who they expect high welfare products. And the concerning part here is that most of the import products come to Europe go to industries where there is no labeling or there is no much information provided to consumers. For example, imports go to processed food systems. And this is, of course, as you also mentioned, very concerning for European producers, who are now also asked to transition to sustainable food systems. So the gap between EU standards and hopefully future standards on animal welfare will increase between our standards and Mercosur standards. Also because in those countries, most of the time there is no legislation about it. Most of the standards come from private companies. So we have a big mosaic of private standards in Mercosur countries. And let me give you 3 examples of where there will be a big issue for animals. The first one is on chickens that are bred for meat. This is also an issue that we have in the EU, but hopefully it will be phased out very soon. And the issue here is that these animals, they reach a slaughter weight in a very fast period, in about 40 days, which means that animals grow so fast that their body just can't handle it. The FDA also fails to address the use of battery cages in ovo products. So it does address that for shell eggs, but as I said, there's almost no trade in shell eggs. And in ovo products, we can still have these kind of products that will come to the EU using battery cages and will go, for example, in processed products. And another very concerning issue is the use of feedlots. Feedlots were almost inexistent in Mercosur countries a few decades ago, and partly for the EU's demand, they have been increasing. In Brazil, they reach now 25% of the production. And feedlots are very concerning not only for animals, for all the respiratory diseases that they bring, but also because they create a high level of pollution, of water, of soil, of air.
What is feedlot?
Feedlots are exactly what you see in the picture there. So this is kind of very intensive systems where cattle is kept. That is, you can compare that, for example, to the extensive farming where they're outside. That was the kind of systems that were used in South America before. And now they've become to these kind of feedlots, where you can control the diet of the animals. Maybe this was done also to respond to the EU's criteria on the hormone-free beef, because they needed to be, you can control the feed of the animal. And the big problem also on the agreement is that all the sustainability provisions in the agreement, including all the texts that were published in December, cannot offset the negative consequences of the agreement, because all the sustainability provisions, they are very nice and there's very nice wording in them, they're non-committal. There's no way to enforce them. And we know this because in most of the trade agreements the EU has, we have the same problem. I sit in most of the other bodies that monitor the implementation of agreements, and none of them has had a cooperation actually activated, because most of the time you need the political willingness of partners to cooperate, and there's no obligation to do so. So the deal is a very bad deal for animals, but not only. It's also a very bad deal for public health and for biodiversity. A very concerning development that happened last December, it was the introduction of the rebalancing mechanism. So this is kind of a new system that it was put in the dispute settlement mechanism, and it means that in the future, any of the 2 partners, Mercosur or the EU, can challenge each other's legislation if that legislation nullifies or substantially impairs the benefits, the expected benefits under the agreement. The conditions to meet the threshold are high, But this actually means that the European Commission accepted an extra avenue to challenge legislation. This can bring a chilling effect to any kind of sustainability-related legislation from both sides. Another risk for public health, and that is because the SPS chapter, so the sanitary and phytosanitary chapter, fails to incorporate the EU's precautionary principle. It does, but not in the right way. Also because the use of antimicrobials in Mercosur is very high. There's an overuse and misuse antimicrobials in the farming system. And the FTA, again, because it's based on cooperation, fails to address this in a right way. As you can compare that with other new trade agreements of the European Commission, of the European Union, for example, with Chile, where the wording is much better. And the EU's VetMed regulation, so this is a new regulation that is supposed to phase out antibiotics as growth promoters in farming, and it should apply to imports, has important loopholes. And that means that a lot of medicines that are actually used in South America are left out of the scope of this VetMed regulation. And finally, on deforestation and biodiversity, there is a big threat to the implementation or the effectiveness of the deforestation regulation, because it will require EU authorities to rely on data from Mercosur countries instead of conducting independent due diligence. It will also, the EU might also have to accept Mercosur-approved certification schemes, which goes against the spirit and the objective of the deforestation regulation, which is not to accept certification as a sufficient compliance. So, what can we do, or what can you do, actually? I think the best way forward would be to use the opportunity we have with the revision of the animal welfare legislation to make sure that all products will have to comply with the new standards, including imported products. And this is something that European citizens care about and support in the vast majority. We saw that in the 2023 Eurobarometer, where 84% of respondents said that they would agree with this kind of change, or with a labeling system. But again, labeling does not really work because imported products go to industries where there is no labeling. And you also have the 2025 Eurobarometer on CAP, which has the same wording, so it's very interesting. What will be the benefits and the risks? Let me start with, perhaps, with the benefits. Of course, the first one will be to have a full protection of animal welfare in the EU. That means that all products that are consumed in the EU will be produced to high welfare standards. It can...
That's the risk and benefit of what?
Of applying the EU animal welfare legislation to all products, including imported products. Because then it's a full protection of animal welfare. You don't have, as the Deputy Luciana were saying, two kinds of products in the EU. All of them have to comply with the same standards. It can be WTO compatible. A report from the European Commission from 2022, and it's from the European Commission, it's not from DG Trade or DG Agri, it's really from the European Commission, said that this would be WTO compatible. There was also the Vision for Agriculture that actually said that they will look into this direction, so that's very welcome. It's legislation, so you don't need to negotiate this with partners. And of course, very important, it will help EU producers to transition to high welfare standards. On the risk side, and this is perhaps what I would like to draw your attention to, the first one will be the scope of the legislation. Because as I said, most of the products we're importing from Mercosur countries is poultry meat and beef. If the legislation looks, for example, at the first stage only to cages on laying hens, we will still be importing a lot of poultry meat and a lot of beef without applying the same standards that we have in Europe. So the legislation must be really ambitious and must really have a wide scope to look into not only cages, but also breeds and also feeds. Then, of course, another big risk is the transition period of the new legislation, because certainly there will be a transition period. I'm not sure, I can guess here it could be 5, 7, hopefully not, but maybe 10 years. And in the meantime, the implementation of the agreement would happen anytime soon, could happen next year. So you will have a bigger gap between the implementation of the agreement and the implementation of the legislation. And finally, this is a big question that we also have, is how to ensure that all standards will actually be implemented on the ground. Because at the moment, audits that happen from DG Santé are not really up to expectations. There were 2 audits from DG Santé from the last 2 years, showing on the poultry and the beef sector, there were shortcomings in antimicrobials. So I have a few questions here. I think my conclusion would be that given all the uncertainties we have around the timeline of the legislation and the scope of the legislation, this agreement, as it stands, cannot be ratified, cannot be implemented, unless the relevant products, chicken, meat, and beef, are also conditioned to EU standards. Many thanks.
Many thanks, Daniel. Great overview. I'm sure there will be questions. I have some myself. But before that, we have the last speaker who will make a brief presentation. We have him with us online. Werner Rasa, Director of the Austrian Foundation for Development Research, will join us online to discuss the economic context and its relation to animal agriculture. It's a short intervention, 3 minutes, Mr. Rasa, and the floor is yours. I can see that you're with us.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for having me. I will try to be very short. I've been informed that I have 10 minutes, but if it's only 3 minutes, I will speed up. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. In terms of the trade relations between Mercosur and the European Union, I think that you have to just need to take into account a few very simple facts. And the most important fact is that trade with the European Union is more important for Mercosur than the other way around. So the share of trade of the European Union with Mercosur is just 2% of all extra EU trade, which is actually very small. For Mercosur, it is 17%. And that's important because it is the background for the effects of the trade agreement, as they have been reported by a number of studies that have been produced over the years. Next slide, please. And that has to do with the fact that basically it is an agreement that will lead to a liberalization of trade for roughly 90% of the bilateral trade volume. And it is not as steep as other agreements. For example, it lacks an investment chapter. And the idea is that the European Union opens the agricultural sector while Mercosur opens almost all sectors with a specific focus on its manufacturing industries where the European Union has export interests. So what you see here is an overview of all the liberalization commitments as of 2019. The important thing is that Mercosur opens up more slowly than the European Union. So, for example, the agricultural liberalizations that the European Union has conceded to Mercosur, and which have already been mentioned by Daniel, will be phased in over a 5 to 10 year period, whereas Mercosur market access commitments will be phased in over 10 to 15 years, in some products also during a longer period of time. Next slide, please. When it comes to assessing the economic effects, there have been, as I said, many studies over the last 15 years. I would say the most recent one was the Sustainability Impact Assessment conducted by the London School of Economics for the European Commission from 2020. And what you see here is that the effects of the agreement will be very modest for the European Union. So it will be basically an increase in total in national income or domestic income for the European Union of plus 0.1% or 15 billion after the full implementation of the agreement, which is assumed to be after 15 years. Of course, sector effects are much more pronounced. They are more mixed in the case of Mercosur, but there will also be very mixed effects on the European Union. There will be obviously an increase in trade, and that increase in trade in exports particularly has to do with manufacturing industries, machines, cars and car parts on the side of the European Union, and on the side of the Mercosur it will be primarily exports of agricultural products and minerals. When you look at employment effects, what you see is that based on the LSE study, There is also a chance that there will be modest employment losses in the European Union of something like 120,000 jobs after the full implementation of the agreement. But what I would like to emphasize here is all these CGE models have to be taken with a grain of salt. They rely mostly on somewhat outdated data. There are no results for single EU member states, and the social and environmental issues are typically not sufficiently targeted. In particular, CO2 emissions from transport and land use change are typically not taken into account, and the impact on deforestation due to increased exports of agricultural products is also typically not taken into account. So all of these ex-ante assessments just give you a very rough picture. But the main message is trade will be increased, but the total effects on the European economy will be rather small, and similar can be said for Mercosur. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I wanted to just give you a very short overview of what has been negotiated in 2023 and 2024 after the conclusion of the agreement in 2019. And what you see here, I would describe as the result of a bargain between the European Union and Mercosur, which basically meant that Mercosur gave the European Union some concessions in terms of environmental provisions, most notably the commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement as an essential element in the treaty, in exchange for the European Union agreeing to concede Mercosur certain exceptions and longer transition periods in economic sectors. So, for example, there have been changes to public procurement opening to the favor of Mercosur, where margins of preferences are applicable, or the subcentral level of government is typically exempted from market opening for public procurement. And when it comes to the automotive industry, there are longer phase-out periods for tariffs on electric, hybrid, and hydrogen-powered vehicles. So that the bargain has been more text, more language on environmental issues in exchange for some concessions to the benefit of Mercosur in the economic area. And the final element is the cooperation protocol.
We are running a bit short on time, Mr. Rasa.
Yeah, I will close in 1 minute, if that's okay.
That's good.
And the final element has been the cooperation protocol, where a new cooperation fund will be set up, or it has been announced that it will be set up in the future, worth 1.8 billion. Could you please go to the last slide, my conclusions? Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. So my conclusions is the overall economic impacts will be small. They will only be phased in over the long term, which basically means the agreement will not be a short-term economic boom for EU export industries. What is new is that while liberalization of the European Union for agricultural imports will happen rather quickly in a period between 5 and 10 years, all these liberalizations of sectors of export interest for the European Union will be very long-term only. Access to raw materials in Mercosur will be facilitated, but I would expect that this will not really change the current situation where European companies, mining companies, are not very active in Mercosur, because that is related to structural reasons of the industry in Europe. The new environmental provisions are largely symbolic. On climate, I would include the essential elements clause also here. And the rebalancing mechanism, as has been already announced by Daniel, introduces potential hurdles for new European regulation, in particular on environmental and human rights regulations. So that would be my very short assessment of the overall economic effects. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rasa, and sorry for our miscommunication on the time frame, but I think we got some valuable points. And if you will stay with us, then there might be some questions from our members. So basically, I would open up the floor and hear if there are any member, any colleagues who would have questions or comments with regards to what our speakers have brought on the agenda. So I see that Thomas will have a comment, and just Mark if you have one.
Yeah, I want to thank you for actually putting this on the program, because it's an important point. I mean, a lot of things have been said already by the speakers. Look, I mean, in Brazil, they can't even say which cattle is coming from, because they have no individual earmarks. They only can say the amount of streams of cattle that is moving. So it's hard to say actually from which farm a cow is coming from. So how can you ensure traceability? How can you ensure welfare standards if you don't even know on which farm a certain cow or cattle before slaughter was coming from? We know that there's a use of hormones, antibiotics, but antibiotics are used as growth promoters. So this is unfair competition. Yeah? Our farmers cannot do that, and rightly so they cannot do it, because it's creating a huge problem for human health as well. You mentioned antimicrobial resistance, and you cannot prove this later than 2 weeks after the last use of antibiotics as growth promoters. The same problem is with hormones. So we can't even prove that it has been used once we test the meat when it comes into European Union. What none of you have mentioned was the live exports and potential live imports from South America. I mean, we're struggling to tighten the rules for animal transport inside the European Union, and then we're having ships coming across the Atlantic for weeks and weeks over high sea. You know, this is absolutely crazy. This has to be made impossible. And as long as we don't have enforceable chapters in this trade agreement, and this relates to many questions you just touched a bit. You know, deforestation, but also social questions. Yeah, ILO standards, work standards. As long as we do not have enforceable chapters, all this nice language in the political part of the agreement doesn't help at all. And look, I mean, we're all aware, the ones that work intensively on this Mercosur trade agreement, that the Commission is preparing a splitting. You didn't talk about the splitting. Maybe you have something on that, because that would mean that the trade part could be put in place immediately, while the political part, where all this nice language is to be found, still then needs to be ratified by 27 member states. Maybe it will never be ratified. So we might even have the trade agreement without even the nice language of the political agreement. And then maybe last but not least, the whole cages story on chicken. Shell eggs, yes, but you know, people, I mean, if you buy a croissant or whatever in a supermarket, you're not having shell eggs in there, but you have so-called egg products, and this does not only concern imports from South America, and these products are produced in old-style cages. And you know, we have to ensure that products that come to European market follow comparable reciprocal standards. Yeah? Otherwise, you know, we're doomed in the farming sector. We're going to lose our farming production. The more animal welfare related, the more animal friendly one. I mean, a lot is still to do within European Union, absolutely. But if you compare to South America, we will lose this production, and it's just going to be outsourced to other regions in the world with even worse animal welfare standards. And so it's yeah. Thank you for raising these points here. And 2 questions were in my statement, so maybe you have some answers there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Insightful words from your side. We'll get back to our speakers to see if there are any comments, reactions. Isabella, you asked for the floor.
Yes, thank you. I think thank you so much to the speakers, and I think Thomas already partially answered my question. But I wanted to raise the question of antibiotic use for growth as growth promoters, and basically the extent of the use in Brazil and in Mercosur region. If you have any data on that, would be interesting to know. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabella. Petrus, you marked.
Thank you. A question goes to probably Mr. Raza first. To what extent you expect that Mercosur exporters will focus on EU market after this deal is made? I mean, is it really a great expectation from Mercosur producers, I mean, to flood the European Union markets, I mean, with many products, in particular the agriculture-based products? And my second point to this first speaker, Have you noticed any positive increase of interest on the Mercosur side, producers, society in general, on animal welfare? Because, I mean, definitely EU standards are much higher, more advanced in this regard. Is there any positive message, I mean, to Mercosur producers and agriculture products growers? I mean, have they got any message from after the all debates and discussions on Mercosur EU agreement?
Thank you, Petrus. Valérie?
Merci beaucoup, merci aux orateurs.
Thank you so much to the speakers. I'm very concerned as to the respect of animal welfare in Mercosur countries. Of course, we don't have the same conditions, we don't have the same rules. In France, we have an organization called the OFB, carries out controls at farms, and the agents are well equipped to carry out these controls, and I don't think that the equivalent exists in those countries. So at the end of the day, in Europe, in France in particular, we focus on extensive farming rather than intensive farming, whereas in the Mercosur countries we can see that here we are moving towards intensive farming. We don't have the same production costs, we don't have the same labor costs, so it can't be loyal competition. It's disloyal competition. So the Mercosur agreement, of course, livestock breeders are certainly not going to be gaining from this agreement. And there's a bias, there's a lot of pollution in this area, and there's also pollution as to the transport of these animals all the way to our countries. There's nothing ecological about this whole process. And then the products, the phytosanitary products, the antibiotics, and we know that the controls are fairly light, and we don't exactly know when or what the standards really are of the food that we will find on our plates. So, to tell you the truth, I really do not understand why we're destroying our own farming here in Europe, and we're not going to be taking any advantages from the food, the quality of the food that we shall be consuming. I'm also worried about the welfare, animal welfare, so I do not agree with this agreement at all. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Valérie. Right, then I will pass the floor back to our speakers, and you will have 3-4 minutes each if you want to react to comments and questions, and maybe Daniel, you could also tell us, do you have knowledge on when does the Parliament need to react? When will the agreement hit the Parliament? Do we know that yet? So we know when to be prepared, but work needs to be done as soon as possible. But it would be nice to know. So we'll start with you.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, I heard a lot of comments, which I mean, you can guess I agree with. On the antibiotics, on the data of antibiotics, I don't have it here with me, but we do have investigations that show the use of antibiotics in the poultry sector, in particular in Brazil. I'm happy to share that. A word about also the hormones and the audits that were done. And this is very, very concerning because there is audits from DG Santé that show that there could have been animals that were treated with hormones in beef sector that were exported to the EU, and there was no guarantee about it. The Brazilian authorities that were supposed to guarantee that it was not going to happen could not actually prevent it from happening. This is an audit from DG Santé, and the response from the European Union was actually not from the European Union, was from Brazil, who on their own decided to stop the import of these products as a preventive measure. So I think that, in my opinion, shows also a willingness, perhaps, or where the action came from. Then on the enforceable language, I can fully agree with you on the sustainability part of the language of the agreement. It's very nice. Sometimes you have very nice non-committal language in the agreement, but there is actually not much, you cannot do much about it. This is something we have seen in other trade agreements. For example, with Canada, we have been pushing for cooperation on animal welfare, nothing has happened. With Japan, nothing has happened. So we know that this is a big, big issue, and it's not only about animal welfare, it's really about sustainability in general. Then on the positive message perhaps from producers from Mercosur, I'm not sure about producers. Well, actually, we look into a bit. We have a report that we're going to share with you soon. It's called Stop Cruel Imports, where we look into which companies export to the EU and what standards they have. And in that, we saw that actually companies, they claim to care about animal welfare. And that's what I was mentioning, that there is no legislation on the ground, but most of the standards come from private sector. It's from here that I get that information, where you, for example, they see that they want in the future, some of them want to go cage-free, for example. The problem is that we cannot control that, we cannot enforce it, and also it's voluntary from companies. What I can tell you also is that citizens in Mercosur countries also care about animal welfare, and they also don't, for those who know, they don't want this kind of intensive systems there as well. So it's in both sides, you know, it's not only the EU telling Mercosur countries, it also comes from them. And I think that's all I have. Peut-être, si vous me permettez en français, sur le bien-être.
Well, on welfare and concerns that you have, animal welfare, of course we have exactly the same concerns as well. And that is why we call upon the European Parliament to really try to speak out and oppose this particular agreement.
Something information that we have, but information we have here as well. The deal could be presented to the Council as soon as this summer. Then we will know whether the agreement is going to be split or not. If the splitting happens, it's also a big, big threat, and I think also to the decision-making process in the EU, because this agreement was presented from the beginning as a EU agreement. So I'm sorry, it's an association, so it's a mixed agreement. And if now we're going to split it, and we're going to have first the trade part go forward, that will be very, very concerning. So that will come to the Council somewhere perhaps before the summer, which means it would come to the European Parliament as of September for the discussion. So yes, it could come very fast, much faster than the animal welfare legislation. So I do please call on you to stop it.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Mr. Rasa, would you care to come in? I don't know if you are still with us. You are?
Yes,
would you
I am.
Have any comments here?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. With respect to the comment by Mr. Weitz on the splitting, I agree with Daniel. I just wanted to add one aspect. Actually, the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter is within the trade component of the agreement. So if the splitting goes through and if the trade component of the agreement is provisionally applied, that would be within the trade component. The point is, however, that all the material means for increasing cooperation with Mercosur are mostly included in the political cooperation part. So, for instance, the enhanced cooperation fund that I've mentioned, that would give financing to build up sustainable value chains, for example, in Mercosur countries, that's in the political component part. And if it's correct what you said, Mr. Meitz, that this political cooperation part of the agreement will perhaps never be ratified, the question emerges, what then about these specific instruments that are contained in the political cooperation part, in particular the enhanced cooperation fund? What will come, what will happen to that? And will there then be specific funding mechanisms and programs that would support the cooperation that is contained in, for example, the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter? So that's one thing to have in mind. Your second point with respect to deforestation, I think there is ample evidence that exports of agricultural commodities from Mercosur to the European Union is associated with deforestation. So I think the Commission and the Commission's view that the agreement will not lead to further deforestation in the case of its ratification is not plausible. There will be increased deforestation. That said, it is also clear that the largest segment of deforestation that is related to agriculture in Brazil has to do with the dramatic increase of exports of agricultural commodities from Brazil to China over the last 10 to 15 years. So the market share of European exports has gone down quite significantly. So for example, when it comes to soy exports, European imports are not more than 10% of total Mercosur exports. Or when it comes to beef, it's below 10%. So China is the main market now for Mercosur agricultural exports. That brings me to the last question with respect to whether we should expect that Mercosur exporters will focus on the European market after the adoption of the agreement and as a consequence of its ratification. As I said, I think when you look at the growth patterns in Mercosur countries over the last 25 years, what you see is that there is a tremendous growth of agricultural exports and also mineral exports. And you have a very highly industrialized form of agriculture in those countries that are mainly producing for exports. So I would certainly expect that Mercosur companies will try to increase their exports to the European Union as a consequence of the free trade agreement. To what extent that will, at what scale this will increase exports is difficult to ascertain at the current moment. But given that there has been a large wave of deindustrialization of manufacturing industries throughout Mercosur over the last 3 decades, the only growing sector of the economy is agriculture and mining. So there certainly will be big efforts to increase exports to the European Union as a consequence of the agreement. And that obviously will also have impacts on deforestation in Mercosur, given that a further increase of quantity can only be accommodated to some limited extent to intensifying agriculture on already existing agricultural land. So there will be increased deforestation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Raza. And we are coming to an end in our meeting. Thank you to our speakers. I think you've given us a lot to think about, and we need to think fast. The next meeting will be the 17th of July, the last meeting before the summer recess. It will be dedicated to animals and science, and we look forward to welcoming you there. Thank you for the commitment. Remember the vote on cats and dogs that Petrus has tabled a lot of good amendments.
Even more, 15 minutes to 12. 11:45, we have a stand-up action, photo action for dogs and cats.
Exactly.
Welcome.
In front of the
Bring
plenary.
your cats and dogs.
Great. All right. I'll see you next time.